Every morning, I wake up at 2 a.m. to let my dog out, and then we go back to sleep together on the recliner. I have neighbors, but they aren't squished right up against my house. There is a field behind my house, and behind that field is a few miles of dense woods. I take my dog out towards the field because he doesn't like doing his business right up against the house. So this morning, I hop up and take him out. Leash goes on, and I grab my jacket. We walk out towards the field, and he starts sniffing around and doing his thing. Out of nowhere, I hear a clear male voice say,
"Hi there."
I play it off as 2 a.m. groggy brain, but my dog heard it too. His hairs shot up all down his back, and his tail was tucked. He started looking around and growling. I was instantly freaked out, and we hurried back inside. I had a flashlight and saw no one. There couldn't have been anyone near me. It's 2 a.m., and my backyard is fairly large. The field is large too, and the grass is about a foot tall. The voice sounded like it came from a few feet away. I still cannot wrap my head around this. Update. Just woke up. I went out at 2 again and didn't hear anything this time. I was on edge the entire time, and my poor dog was too. The spot where I take him is right at the edge of the property, and a large field, so there's no way anyone was hiding near me. The woods start about 40 yards away from the edge of the field. The only things near me during this experience was a single tree on my property and a field with 1-foot-tall grass. My tree is about 18 feet tall, and too skinny for a human to climb up. I even flashed my light on it after my dog started growling because possums like to sit in it. I have another dog who doesn't like getting up at 2 a.m., so her fat tail will wait until 6 to go out. Strangely enough, she won't go near the edge of the field anymore. That's where she did her business too. Even in broad daylight, she won't go there. Thank you all for sharing your advice and stories. It's really creepy and interesting seeing how many other people have heard the voice greet them. This is kind of a long story. I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. I just recently moved to Oklahoma. Recently, I keep having very uncomfortable experiences outside, especially in the evening or nighttime. It started when I went to go put laundry in the washer one day. We have a laundry room attached to our building, and it was broad daylight, so I wasn't exactly feeling nervous about anything. I got about 20 feet from the walkway or alleyway to the washroom, and I smelled the worst rotting animal smell I've ever smelled in my life. Not only that, as soon as I smelled it, I got the strongest flight or fight reaction I've ever felt. I ran back to my unit, locked the door, and had a small anxiety attack. I waited about 15 to 20 minutes before going back out, and when I did, there was no smell, and I felt normal. Fast forward about a week later. My husband and I were outside at about 1 a.m. smoking a cigarette when we heard what sounded like a dying dog. We live right off of a major interstate, so we started walking towards the direction of this noise. Sort of a wheezing whine, a terribly sad noise, when we got to the edge of our parking lot. As we got onto the pavement, the wheezing dog noise turned into what sounded like an owl hooting. I understand owls make strange noises. I was raised in Texas, I've heard many, but this was not an owl. The longer we listened to it, the more it sounded like a person trying to mimic an owl. My husband called out, "Hey, is someone there?" Pretty loudly, and just silence was the response. We stood quiet a few moments before the owl noise completely stopped, and the sound of an unnatural laugh echoed from the trees. The only way I can describe this noise is it was like when a deaf person laughs, like they can't hear how they sound, so it just kinda sounds a bit off. I don't mean to sound rude at all, truly. That's just the way I know how to describe it. It felt like ice water was in my veins as soon as I heard it. Both of us just felt extreme fear in that moment and ran back to the house. I could explain off all of these things if I hadn't seen what I had seen next. A few days later, I was outside smoking around 7 p.m. and I saw two men walking on the side of the street where I had heard the noise a few nights prior. They walked past the trees a little ways but then stopped. It was dusk, so light was low. One of them turned on their phone light and shined it into the trees before jumping back. Both men took off at a full sprint away from the tree line. I have no idea what they saw. I didn't hear anything, but there was pure fear there. The most frustrating part was that I was looking right at them and saw absolutely nothing. Fast forward about a week later. I get a text while I'm at work from my husband telling me he heard our daughter talking and laughing in the field across the street. He was 100% sure it was her until he realized she was inside, in her room. He said it sounded just like her. Fast forward again a few days later. I found dried blood on my door jamb, as well as scratches near my doorknob, and more dried blood at the bottom of my door. My neighbor had their internet cables cut and told me that someone had tried to open their door the night it happened and then slammed their body against the door trying to break in. My neighbor said he forced himself out the door, ready to confront whoever was there, but there was no one. We constantly hear things on the roof, things in the alley behind our place. Our dog will run to the door at random hours and sniff and growl like someone is there. I have probably made a mistake by calling out to this thing, whistling at night, trying to antagonize it because I desperately want a recording. I have one recording of its noises. It sounds like an owl. But towards the end, there's this low, inexplicable moan that comes from the same place the owl sounds are coming from. It's hard to hear and ends very abruptly. I don't feel like this is good enough. No one believes me, but something is out there. It knows I know it. I feel it watching me. If I curse at it or try and lure it out, it goes completely silent or does that horrible laugh. I can never seem to catch the laugh or any of the noises. As soon as I hit record, it usually stops. I don't know how to explain this, but I know I'm not crazy. Please, if someone can help me, I really want to know what this thing is. I have pictures of the blood on my door, the scratches, and the video of the owl sounds and moan. I just feel like no one will take this seriously. It always smells like corpse when it's around. That's the biggest sign something isn't right. I brought it up to one of my native coworkers, and he said, "Leave it be, wash the blood from your door, and stop trying to talk to it." He wouldn't tell me anything else. I don't know if this is a Wendigo, a Skinwalker, or something else entirely, but I have never felt such dread and fear as I do when I hear or smell it out there. Please, someone, anyone, if you know what this is, please tell me I'm not losing my mind. And if it's real, how do I make it go away? This thing is causing me so much stress. Thank you for reading. I'm going to preface this by saying, this is a long read, but it's worth it. My friend and I were chatting about this creepy experience we had, and I'm finally trying to get to the bottom of it. So I figured I'd turn to Reddit for some answers, if there are any. People will probably think this is fake, but I don't care, believe it or don't. I have no clue if this animal or creature is a skinwalker, or just a very creepy animal. This took place around 2019, And I do live in Tennessee, right on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains. So here goes. 2 of my friends and I were driving on a desolate back road at night. We were jamming to music and talking. Everything was normal. I was driving. My friend Hannah was in the passenger seat, DJing, and our friend Chris was in the back seat behind me. Hannah was trying to pull up a song on YouTube that wasn't on Spotify, so it was silent for a bit while she was waiting on the website to load. But Chris and I were still talking. We came up on a small animal in the road, and I didn't think anything of it. Well, I expected the animal to move pretty quickly once it saw us coming down the road, but it didn't. As I got closer, I slowed down to let the animal have enough time to run off, but it still stayed very still. It almost looked frozen. The closer I got, I could make out that it looked like some kind of cat. The only thing was, it didn't look like any sort of cat I've ever seen. It looked like it had fur, but the fur was flesh-colored. Its ears were very small, almost like a kitten's, even though it was only a tiny bit bigger than an adult house cat. It was laying in a way that looked like the Sphinx, facing us. The scariest thing about it, though, was its eyes. Not to sound overdramatic, but its eyes literally looked like the bits of hell were burning inside of them. They were reddish, orangish, and had twinkles of yellow in them that reflected off the headlights. The whole car was silent, and I just stared ahead. This cat scared the shit out of me, and it still wasn't moving. I felt a huge pit in my stomach and began having intense anxiety. It was almost like I was frozen. But I was not about to stop to figure out what this supposed cat was. At this point, I had to steer around a bit to pass it without hitting it. I was probably 3 inches away from touching this thing, and as I slowly crept by, I watched it through the window the entire time. It did not flinch. And the eyes still had the same glow, even without my headlights directly on it. After we passed it about 5 seconds later, Chris yells, "What the fuck was that?" I immediately started freaking out, shouting, "I don't know." Hannah looks up from her phone and says, panicked, "What? What did you see?" She looked behind us and kept asking. We explained what happened and she said, "I didn't see anything behind us." Chris and I looked back and sure enough, it was gone. We drove up the road to a church and turned around in the parking lot. We wanted to get back to Hannah's as soon as possible. When we got back, we rushed in and told her mom what we saw. But we didn't mention that it looked like a cat. We described it as a small animal. Her mom stops for a minute and says, "Was it a cat?" We were blown away. We told her that it was, and she said that her and the cousin came across the same exact thing when they were teens, only it was in a different area, and they saw it peeking out of bushes. She still, to this day, doesn't know what it was, and she said that she thinks about it from time to time, even after 30 years. So I guess I want to know a few things. What was this thing? It didn't look like a bobcat, mountain lion, or fox. Is it a demon? Skinwalker? Wendigo? An unknown Appalachian creature? I've heard all of the legends regarding the woods at night. Don't look up in the trees, don't respond if your mother calls your name, etc. But everyone I've told either tells me it was probably a scared bobcat or that they've never heard of that before. So, if anyone made it this far and has some answers, I would gladly appreciate them. I have a story of a creature on my hunting land from when I was a kid. When I was about 10 years old, I was hunting with my grandfather, now deceased, on family-owned land near Covington, Michigan. It was near dusk, and we've been sitting for a couple hours now. We haven't seen much, just a spiker and a small doe, nothing large enough to shoot. We were starting to lose hope, and were getting ready to start the about 1 mile track back to our cabin. As we were preparing to leave, we heard some twigs cracking from our right rear side. The stand we were in was tucked in the rear corner of a large clearing on one of the bigger trees in the tree line. As the cracks from the twigs got closer, I remembered realizing that all other ambient noises stopped. When the creature finally emerged from the tree line, I remember my heart feeling like it stopped working, and an overwhelming feeling of dread washed over me. What I saw was what looked to be a small buck that looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks and was an extremely pale brown, almost gray, with what looked to be a broken neck and a missing antler, stumbling into the clearing. At this time, the sun was just about to sink below the treetops and cover the clearing with shadows. I recall looking over at my grandfather and seeing a level of fear I have never seen on him before. Mind you, my grandfather was tough and fearless as they come, being he'd seen active duty in Vietnam as infantry. After seeing my grandfather's face, it just made the feeling in my stomach become worse as we watched this deer stumble into the clearing. My grandfather reached for his binoculars. As he pulled them out, the lens cover made a small noise on the side of the stand. The creature must have heard it, because it stopped its stumble, now in the middle of the clearing, and creepily rotated around, and rose up on its hind legs, and stared directly at us for about a minute before running off in a creepily awkward sprint into the woods. At this time, it felt like I just had gotten the wind knocked out of me, and I was petrified with fear. After the encounter, me and my grandfather sat in the stand, completely silent, staring at the clearing, trying to make sense of what we just witnessed. As we started to walk back, we heard extremely weird, almost human-sounding noises coming from the woods around us. By the time we got back to the cabin, my grandfather decided it would be best to call our trip early and head back home. But before we left, I had to use the bathroom, and our cabin was quite old, so it didn't have indoor plumbing, just an old outhouse. As I sat down to use the toilet, the immense feeling of dread returned as I heard human-like whispers and small scratches on the back of the outhouse. I screamed at the top of my lungs to my grandfather as I ran out of the outhouse crying. After that, we drove back home and had a small discussion on what we saw. Despite being an avid hunter, that was my grandfather's last season of hunting, and about a year later, we sold the land. I've told this story a couple times to close friends and family, but I think most of them think I'm crazy, especially being the only witness now that my grandfather passed away. Still to this day, the encounter sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. When I was around 10 or 12, roughly 12 years old, me and my grandma and uncle went to Jasper in Canada. Given how I was born in Canada itself, nothing weirded me out when it came to the woods and nature as a whole. I've seen and heard deer before and a whole slew of animals. I don't remember much from the trip other than bits and pieces, but what I do remember was arriving at the hotel and climbing up the steps to the second floor. The hotel had a parking lot in front before the road. I remember waking up one morning in the hotel while my grandma and uncle were still asleep and walking over to the window to peer out from behind the blinds to see a fox standing in the middle of a road. It looked like it had been run over, given how oddly it was shaped. Concerned for its safety, I wanted to wake up my grandma or simply run out there to check it. I felt my stomach sink when it turned to face me. Its head looked bruised and misshapen, which I would have ruled out as it having been run over had it not stood up on its hind legs. I turned my head away from the window and yelled for my grandma to wake up, who slept in her bed just a couple feet away, before I looked back and saw it walk on those hind legs to the side where the building hid my view from the rest of the road. I looked completely insane when my grandma moved me aside and saw nothing on the road, even going as far as to open the door and peer down both ends of the walkway. Nothing. Regardless, I can say with confidence, I'm not going back to Jasper. When I was about 10, my family wanted to drive cross-country through the Southwest, visiting places throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. We stopped for the night at a cheap cabin. I don't remember the exact location, but I remember it being somewhere between Alamogordo and Roswell. The area around it was very densely wooded, and it was about 20 minutes from a small gas station where we got food for the night. It was a 2-bedroom cabin with a living room, and my parents took the big room, my younger sister got the other bedroom, and I was on the pull-out couch. The couch was placed directly next to a large window, looking out at a creek leading into the woods. A day went by, and everyone went to sleep. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a knocking on the window. I was facing away from it and was too scared shitless to turn around. It wasn't a random knocking either. It was rhythmic, like a waltz with long pauses. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Too terrified to move, I lied there, trying not to make noise, until whatever was out there started to make a quiet, shrill, high-pitched whistle. When I heard that, I started screaming for my father, and the knocking abruptly stopped, and my dad ran into the room. He's not a superstitious man, and says to this day that he didn't see anything, but according to him, the sense of malaise that hit him was unlike anything he ever felt before. He got my sister, and we all slept together in the big bedroom. The next day, I looked at the ground outside the window and saw large deer tracks leading directly up to it. We have done similar trips until I moved out, but my dad refused to go back to that area. I saw some videos about skinwalkers on TikTok, so I started watching videos about them on YouTube. And there was a whole podcast where this guy just read stories about them from Reddit and other stories that people submitted. Well, our ward at church purchased a piece of land way back in the day. It's seriously just a wooded area with a little bit of swamp. Anyways, we would always go there for campouts and scouts. And at night, when it was pitch black, we would all play manhunt. Well, one time, we all got down to one person whose name was David. Growing up, he was super fast, and he would hide really good so nobody could ever find him. He would always end up being the last person. One time, it was down to David, and we had split up and gone way deep into the forest toward the swamp because it seems like it was impossible to find him. We thought he might have gone a little bit further than we usually do. We started getting into some more muddy and wet terrain as we get closer to a swamp-like area where the water is probably shin-deep, and we saw David way out in the swamp, and he wasn't wearing any shirt, and with the spotlight on him, he looked super pale. But he just stood there and didn't say a word. You could seriously tell something was off. Then all of a sudden, we heard David from behind us yelling, trying to get our attention, so we would keep trying to chase him down. Meanwhile, what we saw in front of us was definitely not him. So being a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old boys, we started yelling and running back to the campsite as fast as we could. Nobody believed us. In fact, for years, everybody made fun of it, calling the ghost of David. But then I started listening to these stories, and every single one of them sounds just like what happened in some way or another. I don't know if this belongs here, but I feel like it bears mentioning. I, 25 at the time, female, experienced what I can only imagine is an otherworldly occurrence when I first moved to the Sierra Nevadas about 4 years ago. I had been living in the South Lake Tahoe, California for years and spent a decent amount of time outdoors, hiking, camping, and just generally enjoying the beautiful place I was lucky enough to call home. Now, I don't scare easily. I am used to being by myself, and I carry weapons with me everywhere I go. Being a 5'2" and 110 pounds female, I go out of my way to be sure I can protect myself. There were many people in the outdoor community who told me to be careful on trails and in the forest. I usually do these things alone, save for my trustworthy, though somewhat cowardly dog. But I never felt as uncomfortable, confused, and downright afraid as I did in my own apartment one night when I finally relocated away from Tahoe to the city of Reno, Nevada. I had moved to Reno to get away from the isolation of living in Lake Tahoe. And though it is only about 60 miles away, it felt like a different world. Now the city itself isn't huge, and I was living in the north end of town, which is surrounded by high desert foothills, and is somewhat sparsely populated compared to the more urban city center. But I never felt as if I was out in the boonies, or anything of the sort. I lived alone with my pup, and we liked our little apartment. So to set the scene here, it was early fall. The sun was beginning to set at a much earlier time of day, which was exemplified by the fact that the city sits in a valley. So, sunset seems to approach much faster than in other places in northern Nevada. My apartment sat just above street level, with a window in the kitchen next to my stacked washer and dryer that looked out into an alley, maybe about 10 feet above the small street that went beside a small fourplex building. It was dark outside, and I was alone with my dog doing laundry. My apartment layout was an open concept. The living room and kitchen area was separated by a wall, which had a huge space cut out of it that you could see through to each room, with the washer and dryer tucked around one corner and the aforementioned window to the left of that. With the openness of the space, the darkness outside, and the amount of overall windows the apartment had, if it was dark outside and I had lights on, it looked like I was living in a fishbowl or a terrarium. Anyone or anything could see right in. I made it a point to always close my blinds because of this, save the small window looking out to the alley. I didn't mind keeping those blinds open because I liked the fresh air, and someone would essentially need a ladder to reach me had they been determined enough. As I was removing clothing from the dryer and turning to plop it on my couch to begin folding, I realized my dog was acting incredibly strange. He didn't want to cross over the line from the living room to the kitchen, which was marked by a change from carpet to tile. Though it was only a few steps, he seemed incredibly hesitant and began whining and burping out small concerned woofs. At first, I just thought he was anxious, for whatever reason. He is known to be a bit of a weenie. But then, out of nowhere, I sensed this immense and insurmountable feeling of dread and displacement. I had my back turned to the washer and dryer, and to that small alley facing window. My dog sat facing me, almost looking past me, and his clear anxiety and frustration began to build as I was asking him what was wrong. He began barking, a full alarm bark at this point, and as soon as he did, the sense that someone or something was observing me took me over and caused my blood to run cold. My logical response was, someone must be watching me through that window, the only window that has open blinds, the only window anyone could possibly see me through. So in one fell swoop, I reached for the overhead drawstring for the light and turned it off and faced the window to comfort whoever or whatever was intruding on my life. As soon as the light clicked off and the room was dark, I saw what I can only describe as a perfectly round light, about the size of a small cantaloupe, directly across from me on the other side of the window. It didn't glow like a lamp or light, though. Its edges were perfect, and it did not hover, nor vibrate, nor move at all. At this point, I was too stunned to move, and my fight, flight, or freeze response had engaged so quickly, I had no time to really recognize or rationalize what I was seeing. I was looking at this thing, and it was looking back. I felt cold, confused, my hair standing on end, my heart racing. My dog had gone into full freak-out mode, and was jumping and barking and generally causing a ruckus in the living room, as he could see this all. The light seemed now to realize that I was able to see it, and it looked as if it backed away, or at least grew smaller in size, had moved to the right of the window. It flickered twice, and then disappeared. It didn't buzz away or fly away. It didn't zoom out of vision. It was visible, not visible, visible, and then gone. As soon as I realized the light wasn't there anymore, I opened the window fully and poked my head out to see what was going on. Maybe someone was up at my window with a flashlight? Maybe someone in the neighboring buildings had seen something and would be out checking for themselves to try and solve this odd mystery? Nothing. Not a soul. And what felt like deafening quiet. I closed the window. As soon as I shut the window, I heard a solid 3 knocks on the larger window by the front door of the living room. As mentioned before, those blinds were closed, and though from the outside looking in, it's likely clear someone is home, because the lights were on in that room. No one could possibly know it's me alone in my apartment, right? I wasn't expecting anyone over. It was too late for solicitors. No one had any reason to be at my house at that time, and I wasn't going to open that door. My dog had rushed to the kitchen as soon as the light outside the window had disappeared, and he was in what I can only call full defense mode. Now my dog is an absolute puss. I've seen him run from cats, get spooked by bags blowing in the street, and he generally stays right by my side on hikes and while we were camping, for me to protect him. This pup seemed ready for war, hackles up, eyes alert, growling at the front window now. I stepped in the living room, grabbed my gun with one hand, keys with the other, and slinked back into the kitchen and out the back door to where my car was parked. I threw the dog in, started up, and raced off to a restaurant across town, where I ordered to-go food and ate in the front seat of my Subaru. We car camped in a Walmart parking lot that night. I returned to the apartment the following day, my laundry still on the couch. No apparent signs of anyone trying to enter the place. Everything seemed normal. I never experienced any disruption in that place again for the year and a half I lived there afterwards. I have no idea to this day what I experienced, and it wasn't until I shared this story that I heard the knocking, and a sense of being observed was a somewhat common phenomenon that people relate to encounters with skinwalkers. I don't know what happened that night, but I'd mark myself incredibly lucky if I never had to experience something like that again. So I am mixed native, but was adopted by white parents and didn't know my heritage until I was an adult and found my family. Recently, my baby and my spouse, who is also indigenous, and I moved to the middle of Mexico to be closer to family. The week after we moved into our house, we started hearing this whistling every single night, right as the sun went down and until the sun came up. It was keeping us up, and we were really annoyed. We live in a sort of gated area, so we thought maybe it was some security measure or some weird bird. But the whistling wasn't in measured intervals or constant. It was a weird, middling whistle that would come back on and off. So at the end of the week, I got annoyed and decided, stupidly, but in my defense, I did have a taser, to look for the source and end it so we could get a good night's sleep. I went out and waited for it to whistle. It whistled in the corner across the street. I slowly approached, but then it stopped, and the sound jumped over a couple of houses. Confused, I followed, thinking it again was some sort of security measure. It did this down the whole street until it made a big jump on the corner and went all the way down to this weird abandoned house. I totally noped out of that and went back to tell my partner what was happening. My spouse nervously laughed when I told him it reminded me of some indigenous legends of skinwalkers, the dead whistling at night. I then repeated the same process I had just done, and the whistling tried to get me to follow it again. So I said hell nah, and really did think I was overreacting. I did a sage cleanse. Just as a disclaimer, the sage was ethically harvested and also gifted to me by another indigenous individual. And also my tribe uses it for protection, so I'm aware of it being a close practice, but try to be respectful anyways when I am using it, since it is a part of my own culture. And went outside and waited for it to whistle. It did. I had my sage and looked directly where the sound was coming from and said, "I know what you are. You leave me and my family alone, or I will personally find you and end you." It whistled a couple more times and then hasn't whistled since. I know that there are legends of skinwalkers in Mexico, but what was it? Was it trying to hurt me? Or was it the dead? Or something else? Any thoughts and advice would be appreciated. I've been trying to figure it out for a while. Edit. Okay, I just looked into the Lalikuza, and bro, our neighbor is this old woman who keeps this weird charm in her doorway. She also keeps telling us how beautiful our baby is, in like a nice way, I suppose. But literally just now, when I was reading about them, she knocked on my door and then told me she had my cat in her house. He was eating some cat food, and she kept trying to invite me in. I got my cat, and out, politely booked it. Now my cat is tearing clumps of fur out with his teeth. My father and uncle have a story of living as outsiders, non-native Caucasian, young people on the reservation. Their tale is of experiencing a skinwalker. My grandma taught school on the reservation, and they lived well off compared to the natives living there. From what I know, there's a lot of lore surrounding the Navajo Nation, non-natives, primarily older generations, keeping their experiences and stories left unspoken, especially to those not from their culture. Forgive me if I'm mistaken in any of this, the culture, ideology, practices, or any other part. I'm just trying to tell the story my family has only spoken to me in whispers about. My grandmother, father, and uncle lived there for a few years, and their experience was much different than the Navajo people who have lived there for generations upon generations. I just want to tell their story and get insight as to anyone else who has lived in that community and any other stories some people might be willing to share. My father and uncle are about 2 years apart in age. They lived in Navajo Mountain in the 1980s. My dad was 10 to 12 and my uncle younger. As it goes, they were always outside riding bikes with their friends, natives of the reservation. My grandma was recovering from an abusive relationship with their father and wasn't too concerned with their whereabouts, being it was a small community. There wasn't much trouble around, nor would they know what real trouble was at that age. Trouble wasn't the issue to young white boys on a reservation then. Pure terror was. It was a typical night without any parental supervision. The night was colder than usual, and the night sky was blacker than you could imagine. In such a desolate place, the stars in the sky would light the night. This night was as if the earth had moved to a different dimension, an abyss. The boys raced each other as they did every night, until they were compelled to force their brakes in unison. They simultaneously looked up, each boy's face melted from carefree, innocent, and adolescent to unadulterated horror. The boys stood motionless, grasping their bikes with every nerve, muscle, and strength in their body on the dirt road. To the right of them was a mesa, one they rode by every day. The mesa that paralleled from my family's home, the mesa that they could see through my father's and uncle's bedroom every night. This mesa would become fear and nightmares to them from this night forward. At the top of this mesa was a roaring fire, taller than any bonfire that someone could assemble, bigger than a group of people could assemble. It raged and was unbelievable. It was almost as tall as the mesa itself. More unbelievable was the pitch-black figure seen cavorting around the bonfire. The native boys with my father and uncle informed them that this was not a typical Navajo dance or ritual. Pits began to form in their stomachs. Friends of my father and uncle turned back around without a word and bolted back to their homes. My father and uncle threw their bikes to the ground and ran across the unpaved road into their home. The two came back in a panic, relaying what they'd seen to my grandmother, but she was unconcerned. A legend of the natives, she told them, and shooed them away. They laid awake all night in their shared room, not saying a word to one another. They forced their curtains as close as possible, too scared to look out the window and see what they shouldn't have seen, to begin with. Neither could shake the images burned into their memory, but the sun managed to rise and peek through into their room. A sense of release washed over them as the darkness had faded. The boys left their beds and traveled to the kitchen to try a second time to tell my grandmother what they have seen. They tried to get a handle on what they saw, but it was as if they couldn't explain it. Again, my grandmother brushed them off. With a coffee and newspaper more important than their story, she told them to climb the mesa and investigate. The boys wrangled the friends who shared the experience with them the night prior, and they passed on their bikes. The friends stayed on the dirt road, looking up at the mesa as my father and uncle climbed up to see any evidence of the hell-burning fire they witnessed together. The mesa wasn't much taller than an average one-story house, so the brothers took less than 2 minutes to climb to the top where the nightmare took place. When they got to the top, they were hysterical and also relieved. There was no indication of a bonfire of that enormity, or even a fire at all, had taken place on the mesa they had clearly seen in the night earlier. They climbed down and told the message to their friends, who had also been part of the shocking scene. Their native friends looked at them in shock, but neither said a word to them. They immediately turned their bikes around and proceeded home. It was never talked about again, despite my father and brother asking about it. My grandmother and everyone else in the community refused to talk about it again. My father is a skeptic. He does not believe in anything paranormal. Aliens, ghosts, mermaids, you name it. But whenever I ask about the skinwalker he saw, he turns pale and white. He gets quiet and jumpy. I had to plead to get the full story out of him, and I could see goosebumps and every hair standing up on his arms when he shared his experience. My grandma took me to the Navajo Mountain in 2019 to show me her history and to see how Navajo natives still live on this reservation today. According to her, not much has changed since living there in the 80s. I hiked and explored what I could of the reservation, as to not invade or violate any of the Navajo reservation and its beauty. However, I did feel a change in mood when I visited. My existence felt heavy, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, or if I was invading on territory that wasn't meant for me. Not caused by any of the community there, but just by my presence being on the land. I will never forget my experience visiting and all that I learned about reservation life. My intention is to hear any other stories from Navajo Mountain residents or talk with some people with similar stories in the Navajo reservation. I climbed the mesa where the skinwalker my dad and uncle claimed had its ritual. I felt pretty normal until I got to the top and stood in the middle. I felt some darkness creep into me as I stood there. I've never been the same since. This happened a couple months ago, and I didn't think anything strange of it at the time. But after talking to multiple people, including my father, I'm not very confident in what I saw anymore, and I'm looking for some help. So, I work third shift at UPS, Richwood, Kentucky. I was driving a buddy of mine home a couple miles out and had just started driving home. I was in the Beech Grove area near some apartment buildings on a back road when about 30-40 feet in front of my car, I watched a creature dash across the road. I stopped my car to look at it. It stopped in someone's yard, turned back at me, and made eye contact with me for about 10 seconds. I went to take a picture, and it ran. At first I thought it was the first fox I had ever seen, but after some research online, it looks nothing like foxes native to Kentucky. This fox was about 3.5 feet tall, very slender with long, skinny legs. It didn't look malnourished though. It looked very healthy. Solid black eyes with pointy diagonal ears that were tipped black, with the lower half of its legs being black and the tip of its tail being black. It was about 4 a.m. and pitch black outside, but there were plenty of porch and street lights for me to see it. It was also decently foggy that night. The only species of fox I found online that looks like it is one that's native to Africa and it's extinct. Since this encounter almost 2 years ago, I've seen 3 other wild foxes in the area. 2 were as described by Google, much smaller than the one I saw. The third one I saw was about 5 minutes out from my house, and it looked just like the massive fox, but slightly shorter. A friend of mine brought up the idea of it being a skinwalker, so I thought I'd post this here to get thoughts from anyone that would have any kind of idea for me, since I've heard stories of skinwalkers being in Kentucky. Thank you for listening to this compilation. If you enjoy my work, please consider subscribing as it is the easiest way to support me, and if you want to support me in other ways, consider letting my ads play in the background while I do something else, or leave me a like. It costs you nothing, but it helps me out tremendously. Thank you.